Every inch Russia takes in Ukraine comes at a brutal cost. Tanks burn, assault squads disappear, and entire offensives grind to a halt with the smallest patch of ground. Because Ukraine has turned itself into something almost impossible to swallow. A steel porcupine. A country bristling with drones, missiles, mines, layered defenses, and a military that's learned how to punish every advance. Push forward and the quills come out. Every step hurts. Every breakthrough attempt becomes a bloodbath. That's why Russia is bleeding for every inch. And the idea behind this strategy comes from one of nature's most deceptively dangerous animals, the porcupine. These small rodents would be easy prey for all sorts of predators, from owls and eagles to bobcats, wolves and coyotes, if not for the iconic quote of quills that cover their bodies. These hardened hairs provide the porcupine with one of the most powerful natural defense mechanisms Mother Nature ever invented. Each creature can have more than 30,000 of them in total. Sharp, stiff and barbed, they detach easily from the porcupine's body, digging into any predator that gets too close. They make porcupines difficult for any larger creatures to consume, while also providing a clear visual deterrent, discouraging predators from even attempting to attack them. This in turn allows porcupines to survive and thrive, even in areas where much larger and stronger creatures may roam. In the same vein, the steel porcupine strategy is designed to help Ukraine ward off attackers and withstand invasions, even when facing up against much larger enemies like Russia. The core concepts of this strategy are quite simple. Rather than focusing on projecting power outwards and enhancing its offensive capacities, the country in question, in this case Ukraine, focuses instead on maximizing its defenses, building its quills in the form of dense defensive weapons, layered anti-air systems, hardened infrastructure, and strong civilian resistance capabilities. The end goal isn't to actually defeat a large invading force or aggressor, but to make the very prospect of invading so difficult, so expensive, and so painful that they don't want to do it in the first place. In short, it's about deterrence. The porcupine's quills deter predators from coming too close to it, encouraging them instead to seek out easier, less protected prey elsewhere. The steel porcupine strategy follows that same idea, making a country so fortified that any would-be aggressors are forced to think twice about attacking it. It's simple in theory, but to actually put this strategy into action can involve years, even decades of effort. Because a country that wants to cement itself as a steel porcupine needs to develop and deploy a vast, interconnected array of defenses. That can include anti-access and aerial denial assets like missiles, mines, and drones, as well as asymmetric warfare equipment like portable anti-tank missiles and man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS. These countries also need to level up their border defenses, setting up everything from hardened bunkers and prepared ambush zones to fortified supply lines. What's more, modern-day steel porcupines also need to be ready for attacks on all fronts, with the latest and greatest cyber defenses and electronic warfare equipment to fend off unseen assaults. And they need their people, not just their armies, but their civilians too, to be ready, willing, and able to stand up and defend their territory if and when a crisis situation comes along. Putting all of those different puzzle pieces into place is an enormous challenge, even at the best of times. Now, imagine having to do it in the middle of a war, when you're already having to fend off a larger opponent and deal with daily assaults, drone strikes, and frontline bombardments. That's what Ukraine had to do. Any military analysts would have called it an impossible task. Yet, as we've seen time after time, for Ukraine, nothing is impossible. From day one of this war, Kyiv's forces proved that they were capable of far more than Russia and the rest of the world gave them credit for. Naturally, they struggled in the early stages. They suddenly found themselves facing off against one of the world's biggest and strongest armies. Russian troops marched over the borders of Ukraine in 2022 from multiple directions, steamrolling towards major towns and cities with the express intent of wiping out any resistance in their way. Many of those troops were later found to have packed parade uniforms. They weren't gearing up for a grinding long-term war. They thought they'd be partying on the streets of Kyiv in a matter of days, that their so-called special military operation would be over and done with in no time at all. Many in the West also doubted Ukraine's ability to defend itself, And that only made things harder for the Ukrainian armed forces, who desperately needed aid and supplies from other nations, but consistently had to wait to get any sort of serious help. Indeed, back in those early stages, Western countries were so concerned about the risk of potentially escalating the situation, it made them extremely wary about providing weapons, armor, or defensive systems. In early 2022, Germany, for example, infamously offered Ukraine not tanks, missiles, or air defenses, but a few thousand helmets. It was only weeks into the war, when Ukraine had defied expectations and Russia had failed to achieve the rapid victory that so many predicted, that Western support started to scale up. Even then, aid often came with caveats. Time and time again, Kyiv was forced to wait while weapons shipments were delayed, disrupted, or scaled down. As the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, put it during his speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2026, "We're thankful for every delivery, but HIMARS took months, tanks took months, jets took years. We cannot afford to lose a single day." Equipment eventually arrived, but often in limited quantities, poor condition, or with strict strings attached. Many countries forbid Ukraine from using their weapons on Russian soil, for example, limiting Kyiv's options when it came to planning counterattacks against its aggressor. Russia, meanwhile, made the most of the West's hesitancy. Its president, Vladimir Putin, made regular threats, publicly announcing his intentions to strike back at any nation that dared intervene in his special military operation. Meanwhile, his troops pushed on, intensifying their aggression and seizing their chance to steal as much land as they could. Ukraine was trapped, constrained, facing near insurmountable odds, but still somehow it endured. It withstood the immense tests and challenges of those early months, surviving one year of war after another, and it's still standing today. Russia, meanwhile, continues to toil. Its forces move at a snail's pace, its assault squads are repeatedly routed, its gains are minimal, and its prospects are increasingly grim. This, despite having almost every conceivable advantage on its side from the very start of the war. Unlike Ukraine, Russia didn't have to worry about defending its territory from multiple axes of attack. It didn't have to deal with unreliable allies and aid delays. It instead was able to spend a small fortune on Shahed drones from Iran, and even got help from the Iranian military to design and develop those drones at its own factories. Another ally, North Korea, also gave Russia munitions, labor, and even boots on the ground, while China and India continued to invest heavily in Russian resources, with the former also providing all-important dual-use components that the Kremlin needed to continue maintaining its enormous armor fleet and manufacturing drones, bombs, and missiles in enormous quantities. Russia had everything going its way for a very long time. Yet, it experienced one dismal failure after another, embarrassing itself on the global stage and undermining the long-running myth that its military was still as mighty and formidable as the iconic Red Army of the Soviet Union. As one Ukrainian commander, Anatoly Kachenko of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade notes, "In 4 years, the USSR defeated Germany. In 4 years, the Russians have only managed to take half of Donetsk region." It's a startling but entirely accurate assessment of Russia's utter failure and Ukraine's astonishing success. And it all boils down to not only Russia's incompetence, but also Kyiv's miraculous ability to adapt, to build, and strengthen its steel porcupine strategy, while simultaneously fending off near-constant attacks and bombardments. But before we dig any deeper into that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every week. Now, Ukraine didn't manage to defend itself through sheer grit alone, and it certainly didn't manage it through superior resources or a bigger budget than its opponent. Instead, it was all about adaptation. Right from the start, Kyiv's forces had to think outside the box. They had no other choice. As Barbey, a deputy commander in the 63rd Separate Mechanized Brigade's Unmanned Systems Battalion puts it, the country had to resort to a poor man's solution of taking simple commercial hobby drones and converting them into disposable weapons and scouting tools. That seemingly simple move changed everything. All of a sudden, with eyes in the skies far and wide across its territory, Ukraine not only enjoyed a constant and stable stream of intelligence, but also made it almost impossible for its enemy to do anything without them knowing about it. This, in effect, became the first line of defense in Ukraine's steel porcupine strategy. Cheap and relatively rudimentary unmanned aerial vehicles formed a formidable drone wall, which Russia has since struggled to bypass. Because not only were those drones scanning the surroundings and providing valuable data to ground units, but they were also used to strike back at the enemy, targeting the weak points of tanks, armored vehicles, and personnel carriers, wiping out Russia's armor advantage one asset at a time. Now, years into the conflict, Ukraine has the means to produce literally millions of these drones, and Russia for once has had to adapt. Instead of continuing to deploy strong tank columns and other armor over the border, it's resorted to deploying infantry-only assault squads, sending dozens of men to their doom without armor of any kind to cover or support them. It's a suicidal strategy, and the stats back it up. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, notes that since the start of the invasion, Russia has suffered well over 1 million casualties, far more than in any war since World War II. In fact, it's lost far more men in this one conflict than in all of the wars it's participated in since the end of the Second World War. Putin might argue that those deaths are all worthwhile, if Russia was actually making serious gains on the ground, capturing towns and cities with ease and swiftness. But it isn't. The CSIS report goes on to note that Russia's campaign of conquest is moving at a veritable snail's pace, with an average rate of between 15 and 70 meters per day in their most prominent offensives, slower than almost any major offensive campaign in any war in the last century. Despite all their modern technologies and knowledge, Russia's troops are gaining ground slower than the Allied forces in World War I, and they're dying in greater and greater numbers with every passing month, because the steel porcupine is getting stronger. Ukraine doesn't just have more drones than ever before, it also has a greater variety of unmanned vehicles at its disposal, ranging from simple scouting units to far larger bombing drones, capable of taking out enemy weapons plants and ammo stocks. With so many options, Russia is finding it increasingly difficult to defend against them. Its troops never know what sorts of weapons might be headed their way. One Russia war correspondent summed up the grim state of affairs facing his country's forces in late 2025, stating that the average life cycle of a Russian assault soldier is just 12 days, and that these same soldiers only have a 50-50 chance of even making it to the front lines without being killed en route. Even those that make it to the front are inevitably doomed, sent out on suicide missions into hostile territories where Ukrainian drone crews and artillery units are simply waiting to pick them off one by one. Thanks to this, Ukraine's aim to push Russia's casualty number even higher, up to the 50,000 Russian casualties per month mark, no longer seems impossible or even excessively ambitious, but truly realistic. And if Kyiv can pull that off, Russia may very well be doomed, because it's no longer able to recruit troops in sufficient quantities to replace those that have been killed or wounded. Its army is no longer expanding, but stagnating and even starting to shrink. With fewer boots on the ground and a continued reluctance to rely on armor, Russia's offensive is only going to get slower, weaker, and more wasteful from here on out. Ukraine, meanwhile, just keeps on constructing more and more quills, more layered defenses, more ways to make Russia's invasion feel like the worst decision in the country's entire history. That doesn't only include drones, but missiles too. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Ukraine invested heavily in domestic long-range missile development, elevating its abilities to strike deep into the heart of Russia, hundreds of miles beyond its own borders. From the long Neptune to the Flamingo, Ukraine now has more powerful, far-reaching weapons to call on to deal massive damage to the Kremlin's high-value assets, including fuel depots, oil refineries, and military production plants. And it's putting those weapons to extremely good use. Bloomberg reports that over the course of 2025, for example, Ukraine orchestrated no fewer than 120 strikes on Russian energy facilities, generating a whopping 1 trillion rubles, $12.9 billion worth of damage. Now, both drones and missiles are regularly dispatched from Ukrainian launch zones, flying far into Russian territory, taking out one target after another. At sea too, Ukraine's drones and missiles have forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet into hiding, neutralizing around a third of its enemy's vessels and pushing others back. Warships, submarines, frigates, and destroyers have all been rendered utterly ineffective, giving Russia fewer and fewer options to organize its own attacks. In the air too, Ukrainian drones have brought helicopters and even fighter jets, some of which were worth tens of millions of dollars out of the air. Then there was the iconic Operation Spiderweb attack of 2025, which dealt an enormous blow to Russia's bomber fleet. Over and over, Ukraine is sending a clear message to the Kremlin: if you hit us, then we'll hit you back even harder. On top of all of this, Ukraine has also managed to massively reduce its reliance on Western allies. It still needs their support, of course, but it's dramatically more independent and capable of standing on its own 2 feet today than it was back in 2022. Indeed, since the invasion began, the Ukrainian defense sector has grown from almost non-entity into a sprawling, enormous industry, with more than 1,000 firms, most of which are private. Those companies employ hundreds of thousands of workers, and together they're providing the fuel, ammo, and systems that keep Kyiv's war machine up and running. 96% of the drones Ukraine uses today, for example, are made domestically. So are 99% of the robotic systems used by the country's military. Domestically produced 155mm Bodana artillery systems also make up around 40% of Ukraine's artillery usage along the front lines, and more than half of all the weapons used by the Ukrainian army are now made in Ukraine. The country has also developed its own extraordinary air defense network, featuring numerous missiles, launch platforms, turrets, and other assets, all bearing the Made in Ukraine label. And it's not stopping there. In 2025, Ukraine authorized over 1,300 new models of domestically produced weapons and military equipment. And there are hundreds more projects still in development, ready to unleash on Russia as and when the time is right. Kyiv has also expedited its innovation, cutting the red tape and bureaucracy that so often interferes in the military development process. Its contractors have the freedom to design and roll out new weapons and systems quickly and easily, responding to soldier feedback to improve their creations in real time. Once the war ends, all of this technology is going to be worth a fortune for Ukraine, ensuring it will have the investment, partnerships, and trade deals needed to continue maintaining and expanding its steel porcupine strategy for decades to come. In fact, countries are already lining up to learn from Ukraine's defense firms and buy up the country's world-leading drones and defensive systems. There are plans in place for 10 new Ukrainian weapons export centers all over Europe in 2026, with drone production plants also opening up in locations like Germany and the UK. Multiple German and even American companies have also announced deals with Ukrainian defense contractors to work on everything from AI-guided strike drones to unmanned ground vehicles. All of this is a testament to Ukraine's unparalleled ability to adapt. So many other countries would have buckled and broken beneath the sheer weight of Russia's vast military force. So many would have struggled to survive even the early weeks and months of a war like this, let alone several years. Ukraine has achieved something miraculous, and thanks to the steel porcupine strategy, it's ready for whatever comes next. Russia may persist with this war for months or even years to come, or Putin may eventually realize what a horrific mistake he made and attempt to broker some sort of feasible peace deal. Either way, Ukraine is prepared, not only to defend itself today, but to put itself in the strongest possible position tomorrow, the day after, and all the days that follow. With a small budget, scant resources, and a near-endless array of problems to solve along the way, it's made itself a military superpower, forging defenses that are the envy of countries across the globe. It's made its territory impossible to take, and its defensive lines impossible to breach. It's forced Russia into a position where it has to sacrifice more men, more resources, more money, and more time to take even a single sliver of land, rendering the entire war effort a grisly, grueling, and interminable slog for the Kremlin's forces. Thanks to that, Ukraine may very well win this war after all. Putin tried to break Ukraine. He expected Kyiv to fall in days. He expected the Ukrainian government to collapse. He expected the country to fracture under the sheer weight of Russia's military power. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Ukraine didn't break. Russia did. Despite launching the largest invasion in Europe since World War II, Moscow has failed to capture Kyiv, failed to topple Ukraine's government, and continues to suffer staggering casualties, economic strain, and growing isolation on the world stage. Ukraine, meanwhile, has only grown stronger, forging powerful alliances, transforming its military, and turning itself into one of the most innovative fighting forces in the world. Putin certainly never saw this coming when he gave the green light for his so-called special military operation back in February of 2022. Back then, he had a clear plan of action and firm expectations of how the subsequent days, weeks and months would pan out. Publicly, he spoke about saving Ukrainians and ethnic Russians from the country's neo-Nazi regime, despite having no credible evidence to back up his claims. He also spoke about taking control of Ukraine's eastern regions, including Donetsk and Luhansk. Privately, however, intelligence reports found that the Kremlin had much bigger plans in mind. It didn't just want to take over parts of Ukraine, it wanted the entire country. Now, before the invasion even began, Russian Federal Security Service (FSB) agents were eyeing up apartments in Kyiv, putting their pieces in position for a complete breakdown of Ukraine's government. Once the country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was removed from power, the Kremlin would install its own puppet government, turning Ukraine from a free and independent nation in charge of its own destiny into another Russian vassal state, like Belarus. Many expected Russia would get what it wanted. The sheer weight and size of the Russian army would surely prove too much for Ukraine to bear, and even if Kyiv mustered some sort of defense, it would only be a matter of time until its fortifications were smashed and Moscow got exactly what it wanted. In short, Ukraine was supposed to be annihilated, broken down, bit by bit, before being pieced back together exactly as Vladimir Putin saw fit. Russia, meanwhile, was supposed to emerge victorious and triumphant into a new era of even greater power and influence. Then there was Putin himself. There's no doubt he saw his special military operation as the chance to cement his legacy, to go down in history as a tactical genius and perhaps Russia's greatest ever leader. He already evidently sees himself as some sort of modern-day Peter the Great, and the conquest of Ukraine would, once and for all, solidify his reputation as perhaps the most powerful man on the planet. From there, there's evidence to suggest that Russia might have had additional plans, with the Kremlin potentially plotting additional invasions of former Soviet republics, or even an attack on NATO, which remains a very real possibility to this day. But now, years after the invasion began, it's clear to see. Moscow's plan didn't merely backfire, it went dramatically wrong in almost every conceivable way. Ukraine didn't break. Its government didn't collapse, its people didn't wave the white flag, and its defenses didn't fall apart in the wake of the Russian army's attacks. That's not to say that the country didn't suffer. Ukraine has endured terrible, unprecedented losses. It's withstood intensive and persistent bombing and drone attacks. It has seen its towns and cities wiped off the map. It's lost approximately 20% of its territory to Russia, and its people have been the victim of atrocious war crimes like the horrific Bucha massacre, in which innocent civilians were slaughtered in the streets and tortured at the hands of heartless Russian soldiers. Yet, through it all, Ukraine has never given up. Its people never bent the knee, nor did they celebrate the Russian army's arrival with flowers and cheers, as some Kremlin officials foolishly believed they would. Instead, many of them took up arms, banded together, and defended their land with unimaginable courage. Faced with the prospect of a potential genocide and the complete erasure of their culture, freedoms, and way of life, they rose up. They refused to allow Russia to simply cannibalize their country, putting their own lives on the line in defense of their country. Many experts and analysts have attributed the incredible defense of Ukraine to the innate resilience of its people. But that's a very simple and even shallow way of summing up a much greater, deeper, and more complex concept. Resilience has played a huge part in the defense of Ukraine, without a doubt. But the country's survival and subsequent fight back demanded much more than that. It required an immense amount of strategic planning, careful resource management, shrewd political ingenuity, and military innovation for this nation, which is so much smaller than its enemy, to stand up and defend itself as successfully as it has. Ukraine has also had to be able to respond and adapt rapidly to the crises and challenges imposed by the war. It hasn't had the luxury of time or the freedom to spend days and weeks debating big decisions or mulling over possible tactics. It's been forced to act almost on instinct, and that was something that the country learned very early on. Indeed, mere days into the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was faced with a stark and brutal reality: act or die. Survival required speed, clarity, and unity of command. The country had spent several decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union establishing democratic institutions and decentralizing authority, but all of that had to be put on the back burner. An immediate and dramatic recalibration was required. Decisions needed to be made more quickly, and there was no room for red tape and bureaucracy to get in the way when so many lives and the very future of Ukraine were at stake. With Russian forces advancing rapidly and missile strikes threatening major cities, any delay, disruption, or hesitation could have been fatal. As a result, the Zelensky government soon became much more hierarchical. This wasn't Ukraine abandoning democracy, it was in fact the only viable way to protect it. While Russia had hoped that the strength and swiftness of its attack would confuse or even paralyze the Ukrainian government to the point of collapse, the opposite occurred instead. Kyiv's leadership adapted. It made the necessary changes, consolidating authority, centralizing command, and coordinating its military maneuvers. But this concentration of power has also raised concerns about democratic oversight and institutional independence during wartime. Russia saw a weakness, but Ukraine turned it into a strength. Then it went further. It built bonds with new allies across the Western world, strengthening relationships with nations like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Scandinavian nations, Poland, and others, acquiring the financial, military, and humanitarian support it needed not just to survive, but to strike back at its enemy. It also worked hard at developing its own domestic defense industry, with dozens of new companies springing up to design and develop new weapons, drones, air defenses, and other assets, many of which have proven vital and valuable in the fight to defend Ukraine and damage Russia. One step at a time, Ukraine set about building the strongest, most fearsome military force in all of Europe. This shouldn't have been able to happen. Ukraine didn't have the same sort of budget, means, manpower, or resources as European powerhouses like France, Germany, and the UK. Yet, in many metrics, it has since surpassed them all, defying odds and shattering expectations over and over again. Now, before the war began, Ukraine was certainly not regarded as any sort of major military power, nor would its name come up in discussions of the most important and influential countries in Europe. Now, it's a major player, not just in the military world, but on the global geopolitical stage. Funnily enough, this is exactly what Ukrainian patriots and nationalists had wanted to see happen for decades, and it took a Russian president, Putin, to make their dreams come true. Those same patriots also dreamed of seeing their country come together and the Ukrainian people united at last, standing side by side for a common cause. That prayer too was answered by Putin. Prior to the war, the Ukrainian people, much like plenty of other populations around the world, had diverse views regarding their country's leadership, their relationship with Russia, and their place on the world stage. But when war comes along, there's no room for fence-sitting. People are forced to pick a side, and Putin made that decision incredibly easy for the Ukrainian people. Many of them had friends and family in Russia, and had spent much of their lives seeing the country in a relatively favorable light. The invasion changed all that. Suddenly, Russia was an aggressor, an invader, an enemy. Thanks to Putin, a country and people that many Ukrainians at least respected, if not admired, was turned overnight into its greatest nemesis. The Ukrainian people, meanwhile, largely put aside their differences, banding together as brothers and sisters in arms against a common foe. And while Ukraine grew stronger, Russia began to crumble. Now, you're watching The Military Show, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Ukraine could have simply rolled over and fallen under Russia's control. It didn't. And today, it's a much stronger, more powerful, and more inspiring presence on the world stage than at any other point in its history. Tragically, tens of thousands of its people have been killed to reach this point, but it continues to show those same qualities of grit, determination, resilience, and adaptability that have fueled its astonishing ascent since 2022. Russia, meanwhile, has gone in the exact opposite direction. Before the war began, Russia was seen as one of the most fearsome, formidable nations on Earth. Everyone, even the world's mightiest military powers, was concerned about the prospect of war with Russia, and many feared that if and when Putin gave the order to attack, almost no nation would be able to stand in its way. They foresaw the mighty Russia war machine rampaging across Europe, taking territory and subjugating all enemies in its way by force, with an almost endless supply of troops, tanks and armoured vehicles proving too much for anyone to handle. But the war with Ukraine has shattered the myth of Russian might. It's revealed the weakness of its army, the incompetence of its commanders, and the desperation of its leadership. And while Ukraine has suffered terrible loss of life, there's at least an argument that those people died for a cause. Russia, meanwhile, has lost people in far greater numbers, with estimates suggesting that the country has crossed the miserable milestone of more than 1.25 million casualties in total, with several 100,000 soldiers killed in action and countless more wounded so severely that they'll never be able to be fit to return to the battlefield. Those soldiers didn't die for some grand cause. They didn't lay their lives on the line so that Russian forces could make great gains, capture important towns and cities, and push on towards a historic victory. In fact, the charts show that Russia today holds barely a fraction more land in Ukraine than it did back in 2022, the year the war began. What's more, the country's forces are moving at such a slow pace, trading dozens or even hundreds of lives for the tiniest, most meaningless patches of land, that it would take decades of effort and unimaginable losses for them to even get close to their end goal of conquering the country in its entirety. Even in the areas where Russia has amassed the biggest numbers of troops and exerted the most aggression, its rate of progress remains embarrassing. For example, between February 2024 and January 2026, Russian troops advanced a little less than 50 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. That's a rate of around 70 meters per day, which is slower than the Allied forces' rate of progress during the famous Battle of the Somme in World War I. Even with today's modern technology and tactics, plus its massive manpower advantage, Russia isn't even managing to match the kind of gains seen a century ago. Its offensives in other areas have been even slower and less efficient, with vast numbers of soldiers being killed for almost zero gains on the ground. What's more, even when Russia does manage to make gains, all it's usually doing is taking over pointless pieces of territory that have been absolutely blown to bits by artillery fire, drones, bombs and mines, or tiny abandoned settlements filled with wreckage, rubble, and the charred, smouldering remains of former homes and structures. In short, the country isn't getting anything out of this war, but it's paying a remarkably high price by keeping it going in four all-important areas: casualties, the economy, public opinion, and world standing. Let's look at each of those in turn, beginning with casualties. As mentioned earlier, Russia has suffered enormous losses. It's crossed milestone over milestone, losing 100,000 of its troops, then 200,000, 500,000, a million, and the number keeps rising. To put those losses into context, Russia has suffered several times more casualties in its war with Ukraine than in every other war it's been involved in since the end of the Second World War. That includes the two Chechen wars, the Soviet Union's 10-year war with Afghanistan, and additional conflicts in places like Korea, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Even if you add up all of the Russian and Soviet soldiers killed and wounded in those conflicts, it pales in comparison to the losses Putin has now inflicted on his army. For a time, those losses, while dramatic, were still sustainable to an extent. Even if Russia lost 30,000 troops in a single month, it was able to recruit 30,000 more to replace them. But that's all starting to change. The latest reports show that Russia is increasingly unable to recruit the people it needs to cover up and counteract its losses. Its army is no longer growing and is instead set to start shrinking as the war rages on. When it comes to the economy too, Russia is in a death spiral. Having spent extravagant amounts on its military-industrial complex, pouring billions and billions into recruitment drives, drone production plants, soldier salaries, procurement, missiles, development projects and more, the country has depleted its national wealth fund. It's also suffered the increasingly crippling effects of Western sanctions, which have only grown more severe and intense as time has gone by. Ukraine too has played its part, using drone warfare to wipe out high-value targets across Russia's territory, plunging the country into a costly fuel crisis, which it's still struggling to navigate. All of these issues have added up, taking an unprecedented toll on Russia's once strong economy. While Moscow was able to withstand the early stages of sanctions and other economic impacts of the war, it's really feeling the heat now. Foreign investment has been slashed, with fewer and fewer countries willing to do business with Putin, the warmonger. Long-term productivity prospects appear increasingly bleak, thanks to the country's worsening labour shortage, and Russia's GDP growth has swiftly declined, reaching almost stagnation level. Plus, the country is so busy pouring around half of its budget into the armed forces and defence contracts, it's falling rapidly behind in other important areas like AI and emerging technologies. So, even if the war miraculously ended, Russia would still find itself lagging dangerously behind other world powers, becoming increasingly irrelevant as the years go by. And with an economy over 13 times smaller than the United States and about 8 times smaller than China's, Russia still has a massive amount of catching up to do if it ever wants to be taken seriously as a superpower again. Putin has also seen his stock with the Russian public plummet in the years since the war began. While many Russians have had variable views of their president during his more than 20 years in power, a large part of the population at least respected him or felt that he was the right man for the unenviable task of presiding over such a vast landmass. His decisions to start a war with Ukraine, a country that many Russians viewed as a fraternal and friendly neighbour, and to persist with that war year after year, despite heavy losses and no notable gains, have caused a massive shift in the national mood. Estimates suggest that up to 1 million Russians have left the country since the war began, with many feeling utterly ashamed of their president's actions. Some have even taken up arms against their motherland, siding with the Ukrainians and supporting their cause. Among those that remain in Russia, opinions have slowly but surely turned against the Kremlin, with an increasing majority of people eager to see an end to the fighting at last. Many Russians have felt the effects of the war firsthand. They've lost friends, neighbours and family members in the conflict, or witnessed the gradual degradation of their country and the loss of former liberties as everything from internet access to international travel has been restricted for them. Far from going down in history as the 21st century's Peter the Great, Putin now runs the risk of becoming the most hated ruler in Russia's long and storied history. He's also managed to diminish his country's standing on the world stage like never before. Perhaps he expected other nations to be too frightened or overwhelmed to stand against him. Instead, large parts of the world have wholeheartedly shunned Russia, severing diplomatic and business ties, cancelling imports and exports, tearing up agreements, and strengthening connections with other, better allies instead. Even those countries that were historically the closest to Russia, like many of the former Soviet republics, have turned their backs on it, leaving Moscow with a tiny pool of potential allies to call on, including China, Iran, and North Korea. With trade, investment, and support all slipping, the country's crises are only going to get worse from here on out. All of Putin's dreams went up in smoke, and his worst nightmares came to life instead. His allies and influence slowly disappeared, his people turned against him, his economy crumbled, and his legacy went with it. Meanwhile, Ukraine galvanized, NATO strengthened, and the world woke up to the reality that Russia, in fact, wasn't as scary and strong as it had always appeared. Putin has no one to blame for this mess but himself. He held the shovel, he dug the hole, and now he's in far too deep to have any hope of climbing back out. One thing's been clear since day one of the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine is the underdog. It can't match Russia's massive manpower advantage, nor can it compete with the Kremlin's almost endless stockpiles of tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment. Ukraine can, however, match and even surpass Russia when it comes to strategy, and that's exactly what has kept Kyiv in this fight for so long. Ukraine's military masterminds and tactical commanders have consistently found ways to outthink their often stubborn and wasteful opponents. And one of the most effective strategies, the bait and bleed, is used on a daily basis up and down the extensive front lines to create death traps for Russian assault squads. So today, we'll take a closer look at how it works. But before we get to the details, we first have to understand the context. In a conventional invasion situation, you have an aggressor, the invader, and a defender, the country getting invaded. The defender will often set up fortified locations along the edge of their territory, which the aggressor will seek to break down. This forms the famous front lines of the conflict, with one side digging in and defending its land to the last man, while the other bombards and assaults its opponent in an attempt to penetrate the defensive lines and capture land, bit by bit. From there, it's simply a question of which side can do the better job at either holding the line or breaking through it. This is how war has worked for generations, and it's why frontline movements and territorial gains and losses have always been such clear and helpful indicators of how a war is progressing and which side is winning or losing. But Ukraine's tacticians quickly realized that this conventional, predictable approach wouldn't work for them. Why? Because they're facing a much larger and stronger force than their own. If they followed the classic playbook of trying to dig in and defend every last little inch of ground, they might be able to delay Russia's advances, but the eventual outcome would always be the same. Through sheer quantity of soldiers and brute force tactics, Russia would eventually wear down Ukraine's defenses and break through its lines. In short, it would only be a matter of time until Russia ultimately got what it wanted, taking over the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk and others, and even potentially pushing on to capture Kyiv and other parts of the country too. For Ukraine, that's not an option. So, its commanders had to figure out a way to guard their ground and fend off Russian assaults without simply sacrificing soldiers needlessly in the process. They realized that it was much smarter to sometimes give up ground on a temporary basis in order to preserve their units and resources, and then strike back at the same location to reclaim it from the Russians when the time was right. This thinking, in a nutshell, formed the foundation of the bait and bleed strategy. It's a four-step process, and it's ruthlessly efficient. Step 1 is when Ukraine sets its trap and lays its bait, and this is the key to the entire process. The idea here is for Ukrainian soldiers to lure Russian assault squads, which typically involve 35 to 50 dismounted troops, into specific areas. To do this, Ukraine makes the most of one of its biggest advantages, the fact that it's fighting on its own land. Using their knowledge of the local landscape and terrain, Ukrainian units identify the perfect places to set their traps. Then, they make use of diverse tools and techniques, including mines, obstacles, wire, ditches, and concrete, to essentially funnel the enemy towards those locations. When faced with these kinds of obstacles, Russian squads are presented with a few options. They can spread out and potentially lose cohesion in an attempt to figure out other ways around the obstacles, or attempt to go through them, which can lead to wasted time and needless losses. Or they could follow the seemingly safe path towards their enemy's location. More often than not, they'll take that seemingly safe path, and that's exactly what Ukraine is banking on. That's where step 2 comes in. A war like this punishes mass. If Ukraine makes the mistake of stacking too many soldiers together in one place, Russia will target and take them out with artillery strikes. The same logic applies with vehicles and other assets. If too many of them are all bunched up together, it's easy for enemy drones to spot those condensed clusters and take them out. So, instead of having large quantities of troops guarding its trap locations, Ukraine often only has relatively small squads at each one. They're not there to hold the line or dig in and fend off the enemy until their final breath. Instead, their role is simple. When they see the Russian assault squads entering the area, they fire a few shots their way, which further incites the enemy to march towards that specific location. Then, they take a moment to assess the density of the opposing force before beginning a pre-planned retreat to a safer location, deeper into their own territory. On the face of it, it may look like the Ukrainian troops are panicking, frightened, and fleeing for their lives. They're not, but that's exactly the impression they want to give to their enemy. They want the Russians to feel cocky and confident enough to move in and start their own attempts to lock down that location, blissfully unaware that they're marching straight into a Ukrainian death trap. Again, more often than not, that's exactly what happens. Because Russians are predictable. Their army has followed similar tactics over the course of the entire war, learning little and persisting with the same stubborn, wasteful strategies that have seen them struggle to make any meaningful gains or claim any big victories for several years. When Russian assault squads see their enemies running away from a location they were just defending, they see an opportunity to take some land to extend their advantage, so they move in. But Ukraine is always watching them, as the front lines are absolutely saturated with surveillance drones. Both sides always have eyes in the skies, looking out across the battlefield, scanning their surroundings, gathering and feeding invaluable intelligence to troops on the ground. Those drones watch and wait as the Russians move in, while crews keep local units informed about the size of the assault squad and what sorts of weapons and additional assets, if any, they're working with. All of that information is important for the next step of the plan. Step 3. The counterattack. Once the Russians have moved in and are busy celebrating what appears to be an important victory, Ukraine seizes the opportunity to spring its trap and strike back. All of a sudden, they rain down fire on the Russian assault team, hitting them with everything they've got. That includes mortars and tube artillery to strike quickly and efficiently at the Russian units, before they even have time to figure out what's happening to them. Strike drones and loiter munitions may also be used to mop up any stragglers and take out any vehicles the assault squads might try to use to escape. Their position, which had seemed so safe and secure mere moments ago, suddenly becomes the most dangerous place on the map. And remember, this was all pre-planned by Ukraine, so they would have already had artillery, drone crews and other offensive systems prepped, positioned and ready to fire all at a moment's notice. What's more, since Ukraine's troops were holding those exact same locations mere minutes before, they know the exact coordinates, they know the surrounding lay of the land, the terrain, the geography, and conditions. All of that information makes it remarkably straightforward for them to bombard those locations with optimal efficiency, leaving no one alive to tell the tale. Ukrainian troops even sometimes set up secondary kill zones, just in case the Russians have the time and wherewithal to attempt their own retreat. Thanks to the mines and other obstacles Ukrainian troops have placed in the surrounding locations, they often know exactly which routes the Russians will take, so can target them too, setting up additional traps, artillery teams, and loitering munitions nearby, ready to keep up the fire, not only on any retreating Russians, but also any resupply or reinforcement lines too. So, even if the assault team has time to radio for backup, any additional trucks or troops that attempt to move into that area will be picked off just as easily as all the rest. Again, drones are vital here. They provide the constant surveillance and stream of intelligence Ukraine needs to plan and execute these attacks. Thanks to their eyes in the sky, Ukrainian teams are always aware of what the enemy is doing, and that allows them to also always be one step ahead of them. And once the Russian units have been wiped out, Ukraine finishes its bait and bleed strategy with the fourth and final step, reclaiming its territory. With the threat eliminated, the same troops that retreated from the trap location mere moments ago are free to move right back in, resuming their surveillance and getting ready to repeat the same process all over again, just as soon as the next Russian assault arrives. And here's the part most observers miss. But before we dig any deeper into why this strategy works so well, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show. We break it down like this every week. Now, back to the trap. This strategy is in many ways representative of the vast difference in tactical thinking between the two sides. On the one hand, there's Russia, which has a vastly larger army and has been consistently able to recruit more and more soldiers to replace those that it's lost in Ukraine. Thanks to that fact, the Kremlin's commanders have persisted with highly wasteful tactics throughout the war so far. Time and time again, they've proven that they're happy to throw men into the meat grinder, making the same mistakes while hoping that brute force will eventually be enough to achieve their aims. They don't get sentimental about soldiers' deaths and injuries. All they care about are territorial gains, because that to them is proof that they're winning the war. As such, they're perfectly content to sacrifice squads for a few square feet of enemy territory, which is why we see so many of these small assault groups targeting Ukrainian locations all along the vast front lines day in and day out. Ukraine operates with a completely different mindset, one that's much more about preservation and smart tactical decisions designed to keep people alive, minimize losses, and catch its enemy off guard. Knowing that it has a much smaller army, Ukraine can't afford to just throw lives away. Its commanders don't want to treat their troops like disposable pieces of meat either. Unlike Russia, they're not obsessed with measuring frontline losses and gains or stressing about tiny slivers of insignificant land. They care much more about keeping their own casualties to a minimum while maximizing the enemy's losses. That's why tactics like bait and bleed are so effective. Everything about this strategy is designed to protect Ukrainian soldiers. For example, when Ukraine launches its counterattacks on Russian assault teams, they don't rely on men on the ground, armed with rifles and told to storm the enemy's position. Instead, they used the likes of artillery shells, drone strikes, and loitering munitions, all weapons that can deal extensive deadly damage without putting troops' lives at risk. When the Ukrainians' teams retreat too, they instinctively disperse and take up various strategic positions in the surrounding landscape. That way, even if Russia launches its own follow-up attacks, it will find it difficult to take out the entire Ukrainian team with more wasted shells, shots, and resources. Ukrainian commanders also use their home turf advantage to maximum effect, making the most of the local terrain to place their people in the most strategic, defensive locations where they have the lowest risk of being flanked and eliminated. They also rely on persistent drone coverage to scan the battlefield and gather data to inform every decision they make. Everything is smart, strategic, planned, and timed to perfection, backed by cold, hard data, and designed to shift the odds in Ukraine's favor as deeply and heavily as possible. In short, the entire bait and bleed strategy is about flipping the script, cancelling out Russia's manpower advantage, and preserving Ukraine's defensive lines without needless sacrifice. Of course, it's not a perfect plan, it does have its risks. For example, if Ukraine waits too long to pull the trigger on its traps, Russia can move its own drone crews and artillery units into key locations to support the assault teams as they take over Ukrainian territory. If that happens, Ukraine's own drone coverage may be reduced, and with their eyes in the skies blinded, they won't have the intel they need to orchestrate their attacks. That's why a plan like this demands flawless execution and efficiency. Ukraine cannot afford to dawdle or dally. Every part of the plan, from the tactical retreat to the counterattack, must be swift and without delay. As long as its teams are able to get into position and strike back at the right times, they won't even give the Russians a chance to get their drone crews in position. That allows them to maintain control of their trap locations and the surrounding kill zones in order to reuse them in the future. The end result of this strategy is what we've seen over and over again throughout the war so far. Every now and then, Russian forces seem to break through the Ukrainian defensive lines. It might look as though they've gained control of an important patch of land or established a foothold for further attacks deeper into their enemy's territory. The Russian side celebrates, with nationalist military bloggers talking about how a complete crushing victory just moved one step closer, while Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, receives biased reports from his lackey commanders about important gains in key regions. Then, days or even hours later, reports emerge that Ukraine has managed to reclaim its lost positions, pushing back and regaining territories that seem to be in loss for good. We've seen this in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Sumy, Kharkiv, and elsewhere. Over and over, Moscow seems to have gained some sort of upper hand before Kyiv quickly restores the status quo. The big difference, however, is that Russia is the one losing way more people and resources than Ukraine in each of these exchanges. And it's not even getting any benefit out of the equation, since so much of the land it gains just gets taken back soon after. Over time, there's no doubt that this is having a horrific impact on the Russian war machine. First, it's chewing through troops in extraordinary numbers. Every time a Russian assault squad gets routed, that's dozens of soldiers killed or wounded, many of whom will not be able to fight again. And in the past, Russia may have been able to find enough recruits to compensate for those losses, but that's starting to become a much more challenging prospect these days. Many of the people who are actually willing to go and fight in Ukraine have already volunteered or been incentivized enough to go there. Those left behind are increasingly reluctant to sign up, no matter how much money recruiters dangle in front of them. Second, exchanges like these are undoubtedly denting Russia's morale. Every time an assault squad seems to make a quick win, only to be defeated and destroyed in the hours that follow, it reinforces the narrative that these assaults are little more than suicide missions. More and more Russian soldiers are waking up to the fact that they're being sent to their deaths, and that in time will make them far less likely to go ahead and follow orders. We'll likely see increasing rates of troops either disobeying orders, fleeing combat zones to save themselves, or waving the white flag at the first sign of danger. That in turn is going to make it even harder for Russia to actually make even marginal gains along the front lines, let alone the sort of vast sweeping gains it really needs in order to actually push on and drive its war machine deeper into Ukraine's territory. In other words, through its death trap, rope and dope tactic, Ukraine has made it almost impossible for Russia to succeed. And the rest of the world should be taking note, because Ukraine is proving that, in this day and age of drones and evolving military tactics, the old doctrine of hold the line at all costs no longer applies. In fact, it's a one-way ticket to disaster. Instead, at a time when drones provide persistent surveillance and a constant stream of intelligence, frontline troops have to be more mobile, more tactical, more willing to temporarily give up ground in order to more effectively strike back at their opponents and reclaim it from them. This isn't a question of cowardly retreat or panic. It's about intelligent economic strategy. Because it's far smarter in the long term to give up a meaningless patch of mud for a few hours and save dozens of soldiers' lives in the process, rather than leaving them all to die defending land that, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't really matter all that much. So, the next time you hear about Russia gaining ground or Ukraine losing a position, take it with a pinch of salt. It doesn't necessarily mean what it would have meant in years gone by. When it invaded Ukraine, Russia had almost every conceivable advantage on its side. It had the larger and stronger army, the bigger military budget, more powerful military equipment, more experienced commanding officers, and smarter strategies, which should have all added up to a swift and crushing victory. Instead, years went by, but victory never came. Now, Russia spent more time fighting its war with Ukraine than the legendary Red Army of the Soviet Union spent fighting the Nazis in World War II, and it's no closer to victory today than it was back in 2022. What's more, its many advantages have been whittled away, one by one. And even its final advantage, its ability to sustain a long war of attrition, is slowly starting to become more of an expensive and unsustainable weakness rather than a benefit. So, to understand how we got to this point, and the true shocking scale of Russia's unprecedented failure, it's first important to look back over the course of the war so far. Back in February of 2022, the world watched with bated breath as Russia amassed its enormous army beside the borders of Ukraine. Facing almost insurmountable odds, Kyiv seemed on the brink of complete collapse, with experts and intelligence agencies around the world expecting the Russian war machine to rampage across the border at any moment and steamroll through whatever meager defenses the Ukrainians might manage to erect. Almost no one expected Ukraine to be able to properly defend itself, not against such a mighty and massive force as Russia, which had so much military experience and such a strong reputation in the battlefield. With hindsight, it's easy to see how wrong these views turned out to be. At the time, however, they made total sense. Russia was rolling into war with one of the world's largest and toughest tank fleets, tens of thousands of armored vehicles estimated at 190,000, and vast amounts of jets, bombers, artillery, and other equipment. Ukraine, meanwhile, was certainly not regarded as any sort of major military power at the time. It had a relatively small selection of old Soviet tanks and armored vehicles to choose from, along with other equipment which largely dated back to the days of the Cold War. Its domestic defense industry was small and undeveloped, and in every metric that mattered, it simply couldn't come close to matching Russia. In short, the stage was set for Russia to easily achieve its military objectives. It appeared that the days of the Ukrainian government were numbered, and Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, was already in the process of planning its next steps, preparing Kyiv apartments for the new Kremlin-backed officials it intended to install. Ukraine, it seemed, was destined to become another of Moscow's puppet states, similar in style to Belarus, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin would get exactly what he wanted, just as he had so many times before. However, as history has proven so many times before, war is unpredictable. It's not merely a matter of numbers or which side has the stronger or larger force. Instead, war is chaotic, dynamic, and organic, changing and evolving over time and influenced by a vast web of variables. And even a significantly smaller and weaker force can surprise the world and defy the odds through sheer grit and determination, like a wounded animal backed into a corner. And that's exactly what Ukraine did. While Russia made sizable gains in the early stages as Ukraine initially struggled to get to grips with the conflict, the tide soon started to turn. And all of the assumptions that much of the world, including Russia, had made about the war soon started to unravel, along with its many advantages. Many expected Russia's massive army would quickly be able to isolate Ukrainian forces, for example. But that didn't happen, as countless Ukrainians decided to volunteer and defend their land. Even with minimal or zero military experience, a multitude of men and women showed remarkable courage and genuine willingness to lay down their lives for their country. Russia's commanders also thought that their army's overwhelming strength would see them march all the way to Kyiv, a mere matter of days after invading. Again, it didn't happen. Despite suffering losses and seeing its citizens fall victim to horrific war crimes, in places like Bucha, the country rallied against Russia's invasion. It mounted stern resistance, proving a much tougher nut to crack than the Kremlin could have anticipated. And Ukraine was also helped by Russia's arrogance. The Kremlin's commanders could and perhaps should have made more of their early advantage, using their vastly larger, stronger aerial forces to take control of the skies and pave the way towards further gains. Instead, they went into the war almost believing that they would win by default, and so made many mistakes along the way. They failed to capitalize on their initial gains, never truly attained aerial superiority, and started to lose large numbers of tanks, vehicles, and troops due to a lack of tactical planning and forethought. All of a sudden, Russia's many advantages no longer seemed as large and influential as they originally seemed. And they only diminished further when Western countries rallied together and came to Ukraine's aid, sending everything from missiles to air defense systems to help Ukraine not only defend its land and airspace from Russian attacks, but also strike back against its enemy. What should have been a brief so-called special military operation was about to become a long-running conventional war, with all the casualties and complications that entails. Neither side was truly prepared for that, and the playing field slowly but surely started to tip in Ukraine's favor. Its ranks also started to swell as more and more volunteers joined the fight, evening the odds against Russia's enormous army. Kyiv also began to benefit from the invaluable sights of Western intelligence agencies, while unlocking new offensive and defensive capabilities as more weapons and systems were delivered from places like the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and France. Ukraine even managed to launch a couple of offensive operations of its own in regions like Kherson and Kharkiv. In response, Moscow became increasingly desperate. It launched a partial mobilization, sending hundreds of thousands more troops to the front, while also investing heavily in expanding its military defense industry. It eventually enjoyed one notable victory in the Battle for Bakhmut, after many months of brutal and bloody conflict. But the war effectively entered a kind of stalemate situation from that point on, with Russia making only small gains here and there, but struggling to capture a single major town or city of note. During that time, Ukraine found ways to nullify or counterattack almost every advantage Russia had. The immense power of the vast Russian tank army, for example, was quickly counteracted by Ukraine's shrewd use of mines, drones, and other anti-tank weaponry, which forced the Kremlin's commanders to rethink their tactics. Russia also had an enormous edge in the air back when the war began, with a vastly superior and stronger air force. It could have used that to take control of the skies over cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv. Again, however, Ukraine found ways to eliminate this advantage, setting up one of the world's smartest, strongest layered air defense networks, featuring everything from advanced radars and missile systems to AI-operated turrets and mobile defense teams. In terms of artillery too, Russia went into the war with an unmatched quantity of systems and munitions. Its commanders intended to lean heavily on their enormous artillery power, relentlessly bombarding Ukrainian strongholds in order to overwhelm and wear down their opponents over time. Again, Ukraine found a way. With the help of its allies and its own domestic innovations, it found ways to strike back, locating and taking out Russian stockpiles and ammo depots, giving the Kremlin far fewer shells to work with. Even when Russia thought it had found a new advantage, Ukraine consistently found a way to combat it. When Russia invested heavily in droneware, for example, and started to launch dozens, then hundreds of drones towards Ukrainian cities on a nightly basis, Kyiv's commanders found stronger and more efficient ways to defend against them, with the aid of their Western allies. Ukraine then went one step further, developing its own domestic drone industry, launching attacks against Russian targets, laying waste to everything from oil refineries to air bases. One at a time, Kyiv undermined almost all of Russia's conventional advantages in mass, armor, air power, and firepower. It didn't have the budget or resources to match or exceed them, but it still found ways to cancel them out. Which leads us all the way up to the current state of play in the war, and Putin's last rapidly diminishing advantage, his country's ability to keep a war of attrition going week after week, month after month. But before we go deeper into that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show. We break it down like this every week. Now, as soon as it became clear that conquering Ukraine was going to take much longer than originally expected, many military experts still felt that Russia would ultimately be able to grind its way to a win. That's because, even when facing multiple waves of economic sanctions and suffering heavy battlefield losses, Moscow has consistently demonstrated a remarkable ability to simply keep going. When hundreds of thousands of its soldiers have been killed or wounded, it devised effective methods to keep on recruiting more to replace them. When tanks and armored vehicles have been destroyed, it's turned to its vast Soviet stockpiles to find more. When former allies have turned away, it strengthened connections with other countries like Iran and North Korea to keep its war machine afloat. And even when its economy has been pushed to breaking point, it somehow scrambled and found solutions to stave off an unprecedented recession. But time continues to pass, losses continue to mount, and progress on the ground remains remarkably slow. As long as that continues, Russia's advantage will continue to erode, and that's exactly what Ukraine is counting on. Indeed, Ukraine's entire strategy effectively revolves around making the war as futile and unsustainable as possible for Russia. Kyiv's commanders knew they were never going to actually win a war with such a bigger and stronger opponent. Instead, they focused on minimizing territorial losses, pushing Russian casualties as high as they can possibly get, and inflicting as much damage on the Russian economy as possible, primarily via drone and missile strikes on high-value targets like oil refineries and fuel depots. Moscow, meanwhile, continues to rely on that same brute force, overwhelming strength strategy it's pinned its hopes on from day one. It keeps on piling pressure along the front lines, expecting that eventually big breakthroughs will come, or Ukraine will suffer enough infrastructure damage and economic losses that its leaders will agree to end the war. The trouble is that Moscow's manpower advantage is no longer anywhere near as effective as it once was, and here's why. In the early stages of the war, the front lines were clearly defined, which enabled Russia's commanders to precisely plan out their next moves and launch large-scale assaults against Ukraine's positions. As the war has progressed, the battlefield dynamic has shifted massively, reaching a point where the front lines are no longer defined, but vague and porous instead. It's no longer clear which side holds which patches of ground, with the entire frontline area feeling more like an amorphous, cloudy kill zone dominated by drones, with pockets of Ukrainian fortifications here and there, and small Russia squads doing their best to encircle them. The roads here are covered in counter-drone netting, vehicles are equipped with electronic warfare systems, and personnel carriers are covered in nets and spikes and other makeshift defenses in a desperate bid to withstand drone attacks. In short, the entire zone is a bloody and brutal mess, and while both sides spent much of their time battling to control it throughout 2025, both struggled to assert any kind of dominance. But that's actually much better news for Ukraine than it is for Russia, because as long as Russian troops and resources are tied up in the kill zone, they're not making any real progress or taking control of truly crucial locations that would actually allow them to push on towards victory. Instead, they're simply throwing more men and resources into the meat grinder, weakening their forces bit by bit in the process. And if Russia persists with its current strategy, its losses are only going to get greater, with very little to show for them in return. Because this approach isn't working. Using small groups of infantry and lightly motorized troops to bypass Ukrainian positions is simply not enough to generate sufficient momentum. Even if those small squads manage to evade the drones long enough to breach the enemy's defenses, those breaches are too small to turn into genuine breakthroughs. As such, Russia's once powerful, structured offensive, which rampaged over Ukraine's borders and captured vast swathes of land in the early weeks and months of the war, has devolved into a messy, directionless slog, utterly incapable of generating genuine gains. And that's not the only problem. For years, it didn't necessarily matter that Russia's tactics were wasteful and reckless, or that it suffered such colossal numbers of casualties. It was always able to keep on recruiting more men, hitting its targets, and even at some stages, recruiting more new soldiers than it lost in any given month. It did this via various means, including offering hefty financial incentives to able-bodied men who were willing to fight, as well as exploiting ethnic minority populations, threatening immigrants with deportation unless they signed up, and even taking prisoners out of their cells and shipping them off to the front lines too. From 2022 to 2024, these tactics worked. Recruitment was so strong, in fact, that Russia was actually able to expand its army, which grew from around 190,000 at the start of the war to around 1.3 million by 2025. However, throughout 2025, much of Russia's recruitment, which amounted to around 30,000 new faces each month, was used purely to replace combat losses. In other words, the army finally stopped getting bigger. Then it started to shrink. By the end of the year, the number of unrecoverable casualties, meaning those who had either been killed or too seriously injured to ever have any chance of returning to the fight, began to exceed the number of new recruits. Russia still has a large manpower advantage over Ukraine, but its army is no longer able to expand indefinitely or counterbalance its constant stream of casualties. Instead, it appears that unless the country can solve its impending recruitment crisis somehow, its numbers will now start to dwindle, and every loss will hit that much harder as a result. And the Kremlin should have seen this coming. For years now, it's boasted about being able to withstand Western sanctions and continue fighting, year after year, no matter what. It arrogantly assumed that its people would keep on willingly signing up, allowing themselves to be shipped off to their dooms on Donetsk and other occupied regions. But attitudes have slowly started to shift. Many of the Russians who are actually willing to accept money and fight in the war have already done so, and those that are left behind are largely people who have no interest in signing up for what they see as little more than a futile suicide mission. Moscow must now resort to other means to keep its numbers up. It's already been forced to call up reservists in order to guard important sites of infrastructure from Ukrainian drone attacks. But even a country of such vast size doesn't have an infinite number of people to call on. The quality of its personnel has also started to slip, with so many of the more recent recruits having little to no military experience, making it even more difficult for the Kremlin's commanders to orchestrate effective offensive maneuvers. This doesn't necessarily mean that Moscow is running out of men, but it's finding it harder and harder to recruit them, and it's losing more than it's gaining. The longer that continues, the more the country's war machine will suffer, with individual units becoming weaker and increasingly imbalanced as combat losses continue to mount. In turn, it will become even harder for Moscow to achieve the breakthroughs it so desperately craves, and the prospect of any kind of victory will become more remote and unattainable. Putin, meanwhile, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's too far gone with the war to back out now, and his country's economy has become too heavily intertwined with the military-industrial complex. If he waved the white flag or ordered some sort of retreat, he'd face absolute ruin. At the same time, despite his boastful public pronouncements, the facts are staring him right in the face. His army isn't making anywhere near the kind of progress it needs to make on the ground, and it's getting weaker by the day. Added to this is the fact that Ukraine continues to carry out regular strikes on Russian infrastructure, disrupting the country's fuel supplies, damaging its economy, and crippling its war machine even further. This all makes it harder for Moscow to sustain the war financially, leaving the country facing a growing deficit, numerous regional budget crises, plummeting oil prices, and declining revenues. With Western sanctions also intensifying, the problems are mounting up. But there are absolutely zero solutions for Putin to latch onto. He's trapped in an unwinnable war, and while he may still, for now, have the money and resources to keep it going at least a little longer, he has no hope of emerging from this situation in any sort of positive way. It's only going to end badly for him and his country, and the only card he has left is to simply keep it going as long as possible, delaying his inevitable demise. In 2025, the Russian president had two big hopes. The first was that sustained military pressure would eventually lead to a collapse in the Ukrainian lines. The second was that the US and other Western nations might finally stop supporting Kyiv. Neither one worked out the way he wanted, and neither will this war. Russian troops are starting to realize this too, with more and more of them turning against the Kremlin and expressing their anger towards Putin.
Russia thought that it was being smart. Moving from combined arms warfare to infiltration tactics enabled Putin's forces to make some gains, but it also sent those soldiers into traps. Ukraine has adapted, and its deadly new tactic has created a nightmarish new reality for Russia's forces. They're being hunted down and killed when they're found. This is search and destroy, and it's Ukraine's response to Russia's short-sightedness. And to make all this worse for Russia, Ukraine's new strategy has put an end to a tactic that was working. On a February 1st video, President Stewart lays it all out. He points to the Pokrovsk axis, where Russia has had so much success with its infiltration strategy that many mainstream media outlets had already given up on Pokrovsk as lost. Ukraine near's biggest loss, the Telegraph said in November. Russia has claimed the capture of the city, the Moscow Times reported in early December. However, it's February now and Pokrovsk is still being defended. Still, these claims were happening because Russia was indeed getting its soldiers into the city. Stewart explained the tactic. What Russia is doing is they send small groups forward, 2, 3, 4, 5 at a time. Those soldiers move as far forward as they can, try to take cover, usually in a basement of a destroyed building, and then follow on Russian forces' ascent, Stewart says. Over time, this strategy was supposed to punch small holes into Ukraine's defenses that Russia could widen with follow-on soldiers and mechanized units that it sent. It's a creepingly slow process. One successful infiltrator turns into 2, then 4, then 10. And if all goes to the Russian plan, it isn't long before there's a strong unit inside a Ukrainian city, such as Pokrovsk, that can then divert the defense forces' attention away from other areas of the front. That creates more gaps for Russia to exploit, rinse and repeat. It's a tactic that Stewart says is very effective if the country using it doesn't care about the number of casualties that it's suffering. And that's more than the case for Russia. 1.25 million casualties and counting are more than enough to show that Putin sees his soldiers as little more than cannon fodder. Still, it was working in Pokrovsk and other cities like Kupiansk until Ukraine made a major change. It started to create search and destroy units. We're going to dig deeper into the specific example of how effective those units were in Kupiansk in just a few minutes. But on the more general level, this is how Ukraine's new strategy works. What Ukraine did, Stewart says, is essentially turn Russia's own tactics against it. This is the heart of the search and destroy strategy. Rather than trying to maintain a stable combat line with the invading Russian soldiers, Ukraine had to adapt to become more fluid, more capable of reacting to what Russia is trying to do. Ukraine started to split up its own assault forces, usually into squads of around 8 infantry, which all move off in different directions to confuse the Russian infiltrators who may have eyes on them. These units operate covert. They move from building to building, almost infiltrating Ukraine's own territory as they search for Russian soldiers. But these groups don't get themselves bogged down in large battles once they find what they're looking for. Instead, they detect the enemy and communicate back to headquarters. That's when Ukraine's drones take flight. These drones travel to the locations that the search squads highlighted to carry out the destroy part of the strategy. The Russian infiltrators don't even know they've been found out. They only learn the truth when the nightmarish buzz of incoming drones is heard. By that point, it's too late. The drones destroy, and Ukraine's assault units carry on moving forward, continuing the search until they find the next target. Preston adds that Ukraine's approach can evolve too. Artillery can be brought into the field to reinforce the drones, adding more firepower to the destroy aspect of the strategy. Ukraine is also attacking the logistical arteries that Russia is trying to set up for its infiltrators, which leaves the so-called successful soldiers cut off from their comrades and isolated inside Ukraine's cities. Inevitably, these soldiers get encircled, and they're either eliminated or contained while the search and destroy squads continue their work. What we're seeing here is the active attrition of Russia's forces by a Ukrainian strategy that has flipped the script of what Russia tried to create. The numbers speak for themselves. In January, Ukraine's drones killed more than 31,700 Russian soldiers. Now, many of these kills would have taken place in grey zones that Russia's soldiers have to infiltrate before they even get into the cities where the search and destroy units are operating. However, based on the tactics that we've just described, we can safely assume that plenty of Russia's soldiers are falling to Ukraine's drones when they're actively operating behind the combat lines. As an aside, January also saw Ukraine kill about 9,000 more soldiers than Russia was able to recruit, which means that its kill zones and search and destroy squads are putting Russia in a position where it's less able to offer the follow-on reinforcements that are needed to make its infiltration strategy work. That's huge for Ukraine. It's also a nightmare situation for Russia. Ukraine has made a switch from conducting the kind of positional defense that it had been using in the past to a far more active sort of defense that, ironically, sees it going on the attack to limit the effectiveness of Russia's infiltration tactics. It's the old "the best defense is a good offense" approach, and it's working wonders for Ukraine. If you're a soccer fan, then this is the equivalent of Ukraine switching from a zonal defense system which covers the largest area but can leave gaps for sneaky attackers to a man-to-man system that ensures there is always a response to any attempt that Russia makes to attack. The Odessa Journal says as much in a February 11th article where it quotes the spokesperson of Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin, as he explains how this strategy is playing out in the Hulia and Oleksandrivka directions. Voloshin notes that Russia is using the same infiltration tactics that it used in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk in these directions. And remember, we're going to be exploring Kupiansk as an example of why Ukraine's search and destroy strategy works in a few minutes. As for Ukraine's response to Russia in Hulia and Oleksandrivka, Voloshin says, "We have indeed taken control of a number of areas in the grey zone, carrying out up to 24 search and strike and reconnaissance search operations daily and destroying enemy infiltration groups. This is not a classic counteroffensive. We are conducting not positional but active defense." Voloshin dubs this strategy maneuver defense. Again, that's the searching part of the approach. The destruction soon follows and it ruins the footholds that Russia's infiltrators try to create, allowing Ukraine to liberate territory that in many cases was only ever occupied by a handful of Putin's forces to begin with. Still, that sort of liberation allows Ukraine to eliminate grey zones, which are areas around the combat lines that aren't actively controlled by either side, as it tries to achieve stabilization once again. Before we move into what happened in Kupiansk and why it's a perfect example of this strategy in action, Ukraine's search and destroy tactic was given a major boost in February. Following talks between Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov and SpaceX founder Elon Musk, SpaceX shut down Russia's access to the Starlink terminals that it had been using to communicate with and coordinate its soldiers on the combat lines. This move has an obvious negative impact on the larger assaults that Russia occasionally launches. But for the infiltrators who are already being isolated by the search and destroy strategy, the loss of Starlink amounts to the disappearance of the final ray of hope that many have. Imagine you're a Russian soldier. You've successfully infiltrated behind enemy lines and you're awaiting reinforcements. They haven't come yet. You've been here for weeks. Every so often you hear voices and drones fly overhead and you hunker down, praying that you won't be found. The only solace you have is the Starlink terminal that's keeping you in touch with command. At least with that you have some idea of what's happening on the front, even if you don't know that much of what you're being told are lies. Then the connection goes dead. You don't know why, you don't know how. All you know is that you are now truly alone. And now the buzzing of the drones overhead and the occasional fleeting sounds of Ukrainian soldiers have become so loud that they're sounding like a cacophony inside your head. You are going to be caught. Ukraine is searching. It won't be long before the buzzes you hear become the drones that destroy your position. That's the nightmare that now faces Russia with the loss of its access to Starlink. However, the Kupiansk example that we've hinted at several times already is remarkable because Ukraine pulled off the complete liberation of the city using its search and destroy approach long before Musk made his decision. Toward the end of 2025, the situation in Kupiansk looked dire for Ukraine. Russia's infiltrators were advancing and the gaps they were creating were forcing Ukraine to spread its defenses thin as it tried to contain Russia's fractured offensives. All of this culminated in no less than Putin himself claiming that Kupiansk had fallen to Russia's forces on December 2nd, which was a claim that was uncoincidentally timed to land ahead of Russia and the US taking part in peace negotiations. The reality, as we soon found out, was much different. Still, as the Times reports, Russia had been able to infiltrate Kupiansk almost at will by using a gas pipeline to cross the Oskil River, after which it started sneaking soldiers into the surrounding villages. Slowly but surely, the Russian push had come. The pipeline kept feeding soldiers into the region, with each new arrival creating opportunities for new infiltrations into Kupiansk itself. The situation was becoming critical, Ukrainian Colonel Serhiy Sidorin told the Times. We could have completely lost control of the city. If Ukraine had left this situation unaddressed, it would have lost Kupiansk. So Ukraine switched up its defensive approach. Taking out the pipeline Russia was using to infiltrate Kupiansk was a big move, with Ukraine saying that it had completed the destruction by mid-December. But even before that, the very splitting of Ukrainian assault forces inside Kupiansk that we mentioned earlier had resulted in the creation of search and destroy units. The Times reports that these units worked alongside open-source intelligence groups so that they could get their hands on real-time maps of the war and Russia's claimed advances in the Kupiansk sector. These claims, which as we mentioned earlier, often amounted to a handful of Russian soldiers trying to bed in after infiltrating, became the intelligence that Ukraine's search and destroy groups began to use to locate the occupiers inside Kupiansk. Ukraine's forces were infiltrating the very lines that Russia had been attempting to create. And the irony is not just that they were doing what Russia had been doing, only better, but that they were doing all of this in the weeks leading up to Putin's grand proclamation that Kupiansk had been captured. As United 24 media later reported, the creation of this search and destroy approach amounted to the quiet launch of a tactic that Russia never saw coming. Ukraine's general staff told the outlet the operation was deliberately kept out of the public eye to ensure that Ukraine maintained the element of surprise. As the Kremlin celebrated a capture, the soldiers that it used to make that capture were being hunted down by Ukraine's small assault groups and then being destroyed by the country's forces. This is Ukraine's new tactic: observe, adapt, improve. All of this has led to the search and destroy approach that Ukraine has developed. What was once proclaimed as the capture of Kupiansk by Russia has become the complete liberation of the city by Ukraine. Now Russia's soldiers are helpless in the city. Some are still there, but they're out of options. In an article where it showcased a video of strikes conducted against the Russian infiltrators by Ukraine's 13th Operational Brigade, Army Inform said that Russia's Kupiansk infiltrators have been reduced to doing little more than crawling out of cracks and dying. As soon as a Russian soldier takes the risk of attempting to move out, perhaps in search of water or a better position, reconnaissance drones pick up on their location, assuming the search squads on the ground don't do it first. As the brigade put it, in the Kupiansk area, Russians continue trying to hold the city and are crawling out of every crack en masse, so our drone operators have a lot of work, which means many spectacular hits on enemy infantry and equipment. According to Viktor Tragubov, who is the head of the communications department for Ukraine's Joint Forces Task Force, the Russian troops that are left in Kupiansk stand no chance of surviving. In reality, Kupiansk is under Ukrainian control. The only small group of Russians is holed up in several high-rise buildings in the city center, but this group is incapable of combat operations, except for defending their lives, Tragubov reports. And even if by some miracle a Russian soldier is able to evade the search and destroy squads and somehow make it out of Kupiansk alive, they'll be stepping right into the kill zone that Ukraine has created outside the city. Drones are constantly on the lookout for new infiltrators in this kill zone. Their operators won't think anything of taking out a Russian soldier who's trying to get as far away from the city as possible. Perhaps there is one fact more than any other that showcases how effective Ukraine's search and destroy strategy had been in Kupiansk. Ukraine now holds 90% of the city. Moving on to the bigger question, what does the emergence of the search and destroy strategy mean for the Ukraine war in 2026? For one thing, it potentially means the restabilization of the front lines, though we'll get to that soon. First, as Stuart suggests, it's unlikely that we're going to see any sort of large-scale offensive conducted by Ukraine this year. It doesn't make sense for Ukraine to do that, Stuart says of suggestions that Ukraine might look to push on from the successes it had achieved in Kupiansk to liberate more territory. No sort of desirable result would come from such an offensive, as it would mean that Ukraine has to dedicate manpower and equipment to outright attacking Russia's defenses, when it could instead just hang back, launch occasional counterattacks, build fortifications, and use its search and destroy tactics to tear through Russian soldiers attempting to infiltrate. That might just change if Russia adjusts its approach again. But it seems like Russia's only other option is to revert to the large mechanized assaults that it favored earlier in the war. At least, that might have been an option if Russia hadn't lost over 11,600 tanks and 24,000 armored vehicles already, causing it to burn through its Soviet-era stockpiles. One of the reasons why Russia started infiltrating is that it doesn't have the ability to attack in the way it once did. So what Ukraine will more likely do, based on Stuart's analysis, is continue the sort of work that we've seen in places like Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. The cities that Russia is trying to take will become death traps all across the front lines, as they're roamed by search and destroy squads backed by drones. Ukraine already said that it's conducting 25% of the offensive operations across some parts of the combat lines, and it's likely that most of these offensives amount to search and destroy squads, well, destroying. Small-scale counterattacks conducted by Ukraine are far more likely, Stuart claims, and these counterattacks will likely be in service of achieving the stabilization of the front lines that we mentioned a moment ago. It's more about stabilizing the lines and reinforcing this kill zone that's been created across the Eastern Front, Stuart says of Ukraine's strategy. Those kill zones are what Ukraine will be relying on to cause the 50,000 kills of Russian soldiers per month that the country is aiming for in 2026. Search and destroy squads will, in that context, play the supporting role. The kill zones take out most of what Russia tries to send, and the squads in the cities and settlements handle those that get through and occupy the grey zones so they can be fortified and made part of the kill zones. All of this will serve any aspect of Ukraine's strategy moving forward, taking out Russian targets in the near rear. The Wall Street Journal suggests that Ukraine should be targeting the drone command centers and headquarters that Russia has set up in occupied territories. Ukrainian forces could better resist the relentless Russian pressure if they focused more on targeting Russian drone operators and company battalion command posts many miles behind the line of contact, the outlet says, drawing on comments made by the commander of Ukraine's 225th Assault Regiment, Major Ole Shiryayev. That's difficult to do when the combat lines are destabilized, as Ukraine needs safe places from which to launch its drones if it's going to attack these kinds of military nodes. Search and destroy is the strategy that stabilizes. And with that stabilization comes the ability to launch new mid-strike drones that Ukraine has been developing to target the precise kinds of nodes that Shiryayev mentions. Those drones can strike where Ukraine's artillery and FPV drones aren't able to reach. The idea will be to create a circuit of failure for Russia. Putin will continue to order assaults, but as the mid-strike drones take out command centers, drone operators, depots, and much more behind the lines, the assaults that Russia carries out will be weakened. Infiltrators that do manage to break through won't get the support that they need, and they'll be constantly hunted by Ukraine's search and destroy squads. The kill zones will get stronger, more Russians will die, and Putin will only be able to watch as what he thought was the winning strategy in Ukraine is turned against him. Ultimately, this also means that Russia's tricks will no longer work. Sure, Russia will continue to claim that it's taken territory, as it did in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, but the reality will be that occupation amounts to 1 or 2 soldiers who get destroyed within days, if not hours, of trying to establish footholds. Search and destroy sets up so much for Ukraine, and it leaves little more than increasingly unconvincing propaganda victories for Russia.
As Putin continues to demand that Ukraine cede the Donbass region to Russia, he's trying to hide a big problem. Donetsk, which is part of the Donbass, is home to a wall that is already stopping Russia cold in Ukraine. Putin needs to break that wall to take Donetsk. Russia's forces can't do it. They're smashing up against 30 miles of territory where they pay for every inch that they gain with blood. Now all Ukraine has to do is avoid the massive strategic mistake that one of its allies is pressuring it to make. Collectively, those 30 miles are known as the Donetsk Fortress Belt, and they amount to an enormous barrier that stands in the way of Putin's goal to take the Donbass. Located in the western Donetsk region, the belt is among the most fortified parts of Ukraine, as the country's forces have spent the better part of a decade transforming it into a wall designed to destroy Russian soldiers. Several cities and settlements combine to form this belt. 4 major Ukrainian urban centers, namely Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Konstantinivka, have created a nearly impenetrable barrier that Russia hasn't been able to test properly yet. The embattled settlements of Pokrovsk and Chaziv Yar sit just outside the belt. Once the heart of Ukraine's industrial region, these cities now combine to form a series of fortifications that link with smaller settlements in the surrounding areas and the logistical artery that is the H20 highway to give Putin his toughest challenge in Ukraine yet. It's a challenge that Russia's president doesn't want to meet. And we'll be covering 4 reasons why it would be a strategic mistake for Ukraine not to force Putin to meet that challenge soon, so keep watching. Ukraine has placed a special focus on the cities that make up the fortress belt because Russia has occupied them once before. Back in 2014, the Wall Street Journal reports all 4 of the major cities that make up the fortress belt were seized by Russian paramilitary forces. Ukraine booted those forces out in relatively short order. However, the Russian warning shot had been fired and Ukraine took it very seriously. Ukraine knew, long before anybody else, that Putin and his forces would be back to steal what Putin believes to be his. So the country set about transforming the formerly occupied cities into the fortress belt. That belt is now stronger than ever and ready to defend Donetsk and potentially the rest of Ukraine from the Russian onslaught. The Wall Street Journal says that Ukraine has spent over $1 billion on fortifications in the Donetsk region alone. With much of the eastern part of the territory under Russian occupation, the obvious conclusion is that most of this money has been poured into the fortress belt. Over a decade of effort has turned the territory into a Ukrainian stronghold, made up of a network of trenches with anti-tank ditches, rows of concrete pyramids known as Dragon's Teeth, barbed wire, and minefields, the journal says. What this means, as The Economist noted in a January 7th article, is that Ukraine now has the 30-mile fortress belt that it wished it had back when Putin's forces invaded in 2022. Such complete defensive lines would have stopped Russia far deeper into Donetsk, according to the commander of the drone battalion that is part of Ukraine's 44th Mechanized Brigade, Vyacheslav Shutenko. The same outlet highlights how extensive these new defensive lines have become. Near Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, the defensive lines stretch for almost 200 meters, or about 656 feet. They are filled with belts of razor wire and anti-infantry wire laid to tear Russia's soldiers to shreds as they attempt to cross. Behind that wire are the anti-tank ditches, which are over 6 feet deep, 9.8 feet wide, and amount to open graves just waiting for Russian armor that will get trapped and then destroyed by artillery and drones. And so it continues. More wire, more ditches, mines and dragon's teeth make their appearances a little closer to the cities. These fortifications run across the entire 30 miles of the fortress belt, and they will be incredibly difficult to break down. After all, these are just the defenses. Ukraine's offensive weapons, especially its FPV drones, will be on constant patrols, aided by reconnaissance drones and ready to deliver their explosive payloads to the Russian soldiers and equipment that are unfortunate enough to be ordered to make the crossing. There are also similar scenes emerging in the cities that make up the belt, The Economist says. Konstantinivka, which is widely believed to be Putin's next target if Pokrovsk falls, already has streets that are laced with razor wire. Ukraine is signaling its intent to bleed Russia dry for every inch that it attempts to take in the belt. And even the fall of Konstantinivka would just mean that there are 3 cities left, including the much larger Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Ukraine's fortress belt gets even cleverer than that. According to the Atlantic Council, concealed within the fortress belt are non-traditional barriers that complement all of the static ones we've just discussed. Ukraine is building concealed and flexible defensive networks that amount to small-scale defensive positions that are embedded in tree lines or situated underground. Decoys and remote fires support this network of nodes, which are in place to both ambush invading Russian soldiers and to corral them into pre-prepared kill zones where drones and artillery will rain down upon them. The Ukraine war has often been called a meat grinder for Russia's soldiers. These nodes combine to form the funnel that moves that meat into the defenses that will tear that meat to shreds. In short, the fortress belt is hell made real on earth for Russia's soldiers. But if Putin wants Donetsk, the belt has to fall. And Putin really wants Donetsk. As the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, points out, the regions of Donetsk that are behind the fortress belt are considerably less defensible than the belt itself. Flat ground comes after the favorable terrain seen in the belt, the ISW says, and Ukraine would have to rush to build more fortifications across the Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk sectors to defend against a Russian advance that would naturally accelerate once the hilly terrain of the fortress belt is conquered. The Wall Street Journal agrees with this assessment, adding that Putin likely sees the price that he would have to pay in soldiers' blood to capture the fortress belt as one that is worth paying. It's just one that he wants to avoid paying, as you'll discover when we get to the strategic mistake that Ukraine has to avoid. The fall of the fortress belt would almost inevitably lead to the loss of Donetsk. Putin would have everything that he wants for now. And that brings us to the strategic mistake that Ukraine has to avoid making. Right now, the fortress belt is making headlines not because it's a brilliant example of the defenses that Ukraine has set up, but because it's part of the territory that Putin is demanding that Ukraine cede to Russia. The reason for those headlines is simple. The US has allegedly renewed its pressure on Ukraine to give up Donetsk in the Donbas region. On January 26, the United 24 media reported that the Kremlin had reaffirmed that the ceding of the Donbas region would be key to any peace negotiations with Ukraine. That affirmation came in the wake of talks between representatives of Ukraine and Russia in Abu Dhabi. Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, made clear what Russia wants in a statement where he said, "The territorial issue is of fundamental importance to the Russian side." Ukraine continues to reject this request, though a second round of talks is scheduled to begin during the weekend starting on January 31st. Just a day later, the US reportedly came wading in with a new round of pressure intended to force Ukraine's hand in giving Putin exactly what he wants. According to Reuters, the US has told Ukraine that it will provide security guarantees if a peace agreement is reached. However, it will likely only provide those guarantees if Ukraine hands over the Donbas. This is a massive twist in the proceedings, as it would essentially make Ukraine subservient to the US and more vulnerable to Russia. After all, losing the Donbas means losing Donetsk, and with Donetsk gone, Russia would control the fortress belt. Making things worse for Ukraine is that there is a cloud of uncertainty over what guarantees the US would actually provide. It was only on January 25th that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was claiming that a document on the security guarantees to be provided by the US was 100% ready and just waiting to be signed. Presumably, that document didn't contain any conditions about Ukraine ceding the Donbas, otherwise Zelensky wouldn't be saying that it's ready. Just 2 days later, the US is telling Ukraine to make the single biggest strategic mistake it could make against Russia, allegedly. The reason that we say allegedly is that January 27th also brought with it a report in the Kyiv Independent in which the US denied attempting to use security guarantees as the carrot on the end of a stick that would see Ukraine lose the Donbass. However, the outlet could only quote an unnamed US source who is reportedly close to the matter. That source said that the US is not trying to force any territorial concessions upon Ukraine, before adding, both sides must agree to a peace deal, but the contents of the peace deal are up to Russia and Ukraine. That quote doesn't specifically say that the US is using promises of security guarantees to get its way, but the denial of pressure for concessions is hope enough for Ukraine. It has to be. Losing the fortress belt that Ukraine has spent so long building would be an enormous mistake, and there are 4 key reasons why. The first of the reasons is also the most obvious. Losing the fortress belt leaves Ukraine low on defenses. That's obviously the case while the Ukraine war is ongoing, which is why Ukraine must use this 30-mile barrier to wreak as much havoc on Russia as possible. However, it would also be true if Ukraine ceded the fortress belt as part of a peace deal with Russia. As the Wall Street Journal notes, taking the fortress belt would put Russia in a prime position to seize Donetsk and to further fight into Ukraine whenever it's ready. The belt will become both a launching point and a barrier to any future Ukrainian effort to retake its territory. Why would that matter if the ceding of the belt is a part of a peace deal? Zelensky said it himself back in April 2025 when he pointed out that Putin has broken a staggering 25 peace agreements over the previous decade. Ukraine knows that Russia's president is a sort of man who will say one thing and do another, and it believes that any peace agreement formed that doesn't involve Russia leaving Ukraine entirely isn't really a deal at all. It's a piece of paper that Putin will tear up the moment he feels Russia is ready to take the rest of Ukraine. This is an assessment that Nick Reynolds, who is a research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, broadly agrees with. Reynolds tells the BBC, even if the Trump administration tries to use ongoing US support or security guarantees as leverage based on previous Russian behavior, based on the explicitly transactional approach that the US administration has taken, it's hard to see how the Ukrainian government would want to give up that territory. Very hard indeed, especially when you take the second reason why ceding the fortress belt would be such a massive mistake. Russia is destroying itself in its attempt to take the Donbass, and attacking the fortress belt would only lead to more losses. Ukraine today says that Russia is unlikely to be able to capture the Donetsk region by August 2027, which is an assessment it appears to have drawn from an interview published by the ISW in December 2025. That interview noted that Russia has managed to conduct small infiltration operations into Konstantinivka, which is one of the fortress belt cities, but those infiltration attempts haven't amounted to much, and it's going to take so many resources to tackle the entire belt that 2027 is the best that Putin can hope for. 2028 appears to be just as likely, assuming that Ukraine continues to receive support from its international partners. Assuming an end of 2028 deadline, that would mean almost another 3 years of fighting for the belt to fall, and Russia knows that it can't sustain the kinds of losses required to finish that fight. Pokrovsk has shown Putin that much. We mentioned Pokrovsk earlier as one of the cities that lies just outside the fortress belt. The city, which had a pre-war population of around 60,000 people, has been under siege for well over a year, with the Wall Street Journal claiming that Russia has amassed over 150,000 troops in the Pokrovsk sector for a final assault on the city that was meant to have ended last year but is still ongoing. Russia has already lost enormous numbers of soldiers in the battle for Pokrovsk. In October, David Axe claimed in his Trench Arc column that Russia has sustained 100,000 casualties between the start of 2025 and the beginning of October, all while trying to claim Pokrovsk. About a month later, Zelensky said that Ukraine's drones had eliminated 25,000 Russian soldiers, most of whom were operating in the Pokrovsk sector. There have been many more deaths since, but you get the picture. Pokrovsk has been far from an easy city for Russia to take. That city has been characterized as the gateway to Donetsk in Russian media, but nothing could be further from the truth now that the fortress belt has been built up. Some of the cities that Russia still has to topple, and it hasn't even taken Pokrovsk yet, are even bigger. Sloviansk, for instance, had a pre-war population of 111,000 people. Kramatorsk is even bigger with a pre-war population of 200,000 people, according to Le Monde. Much larger cities than Pokrovsk have more territory to capture, which means an even slower Russian advance. Ukraine will also take the lessons that it has learned from the defense of Pokrovsk into these cities. So the question has to be asked, if Russia has taken so long and lost so many soldiers in its siege of Pokrovsk, just how much longer will it take, and how many more losses will it have to absorb to topple the fortress belt? Making sure that Russia gets an answer to that question is a huge reason for Ukraine to force Russia into the fight for the fortress belt that Putin is trying to avoid. Who knows? Ukraine might even be able to achieve the casualty ratio of 15 Russian soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian that it's seeing in Pokrovsk. You can find out more about that ratio and what it means for Russia's attempts to take Pokrovsk in our video. The point in all of this is that Russia has been trying to frame Donetsk as a free gain, as United 24 media puts it. Putin wants the West, and especially the US, to think that Russia will easily take the rest of Donetsk once Pokrovsk falls, precisely because he knows that nothing is further from the truth. As long as Ukraine has the fortress belt, it has what amounts to a weapon that will cost Russia years of extra warfare, along with hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions more casualties. The craziest thing about all of this is that the 2027 and 28 estimates may even be a little bit too kind to Russia and its bumbling war effort, and that's because of the third reason why Ukraine ceding the fortress belt will be a massive mistake. Russia's rate of advance is slowing dramatically. That's according to the New Voice of Ukraine, which highlights statements made by ISW analysts that the 2027 deadline has conditions that Russia isn't coming close to meeting. For Russia to seize Donetsk by the end of August 2027, it would have to maintain the pace of advances it saw in November 2025. And even then, taking the region would be a big ask. But Russia hasn't been maintaining the pace of its monthly advances. December 2025 and early January 26 saw that pace slow to a crawl, which, if Russia isn't able to speed up, could add months or even years for the time it would take for Donetsk to fall. We don't need to go much deeper into this reason beyond noting the obvious. The longer that Russia has to fight for Donetsk, the more of its soldiers, tanks, artillery, and other equipment it will lose. We said earlier that Ukraine will bleed Russia dry for every inch that it takes in the fortress belt, and we meant that in terms of time, equipment, and monetary cost, as much as we did for the price that Russia is paying in manpower. And finally, that brings us to the fourth reason why Ukraine ceding the fortress belt would be a huge strategic mistake. Ukraine likely still has no idea what a security guarantee in return for making this decision would look like. After all, Russia has made it clear that there are certain people whom it won't allow to take part in the ongoing protection of Ukraine. January 26 saw Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service head Sergei Naryshkin claim that terms being put forth by the Coalition of the Willing, which has also promised security guarantees to Ukraine, were absolutely unacceptable. That likely amounts to Naryshkin saying that coalition members won't be allowed into Ukraine under a peace deal. A day later, the Russian State Duma Defense Committee Deputy Chairman, Alexei Zhuravlyov, seemed to confirm this by openly rejecting the prospect of any NATO troops deploying into Ukraine after the war. That means the Coalition of the Willing is out. And it also leads to a lot of questions being asked about the US promises, given that it's a NATO member. Ultimately, Putin won't stop at Donetsk or the Donbass if he gets his hands on them. Russia's president has very openly said that he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a real country, to the point where he believes that Ukrainians are actually Russians. Ceding the fortress belt today means that Ukraine sets itself up for a fall tomorrow. And with Russia struggling to maintain the strength of its assaults, that is a blunder from which Ukraine would never recover. So it won't make that mistake. It will keep its 30 miles of fortifications and Russia will bleed trying to take them. Russia is doing that right now, and it's because Ukraine has an unexpected ally on its side. It's something so terrifying that it leaves Russian soldiers paralyzed with fear. Built with the help of Ukraine's partners, it is a literal wall of death that kills Russian soldiers the moment they're stupid enough to attempt to cross it. A new level of fear has been unlocked. A new stage of slaughter has been achieved. When the Russians move, they die. And it's all thanks to something that Ukraine has been building for an entire year, the drone line. This wall of death has cost Ukraine and its partners just $880 million to build so far, which is a drop in the ocean when compared to the $2.5 trillion that United 24 media reports the Ukraine war has cost Russia so far. And in return for that outlay, Ukraine has built a systematized wall of drone-based defenses that are shredding through Russia's forces as they attempt assaults. The front line is now a death sentence for Russia due to a program that has seen Ukraine combine 1,000 drone crews into a cohesive unit of fighters that are now responsible for a third of all the kills that Ukraine achieves against the Russian military. What does that add up to? During this winter alone, the drone line has destroyed 30,000 Russians. And as you'll discover if you stick with us, it's only going to get bigger, stronger, and more effective. But hold on a second. Ukraine using drones to shatter Russia's offensives is hardly a new concept. It's been doing just that from the very start of the war, and plenty has been written and said about how Ukraine's use of drones has been key to its defense and is forcing other countries to completely rewrite their military doctrines. With all of that being true, it's natural to wonder just what this drone line is, if not just another phrase to describe what Ukraine has been doing. So let's explain why the drone line is so important. Back in March 2025, Ukraine launched what it called the drone line doctrine, which it said was designed to strengthen the country's frontline defenses. The idea was to take Ukraine's existing use of drones from a defense that typically relied on isolated drone units working in tandem with ground forces and turn it into a systematic form of coordinated defense that Ukraine could apply across the entire front. In other words, the drone usage that had already grabbed so much of the spotlight in the Ukraine war was going to be formalized into a new military doctrine to make those drones more efficient and effective than they had ever been before. Ukraine's former defense minister Rustem Umerov announced the project launch in a Facebook video, and he explained that the ultimate goal was to equip Ukraine's specialized drone units with more modern resources and technology, along with specially trained personnel. These units would then work in tandem to create what Militani refers to as a 10 to 15 kilometer or 6.2 to 9.3 mile no-go zone that would make it impossible for Russia to approach key Ukrainian fortifications without incurring enormous losses for doing so. The project was wide-ranging and involved the recruitment of military personnel and civilians into some of Ukraine's most important drone units, such as the Birds of Magyar. Fast forward a year, and we're now seeing the fruits of this project in Ukraine. In March 2026, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported on how the drone line has expanded in scale and scope since it was announced the year before. The drone line is now much more than a set of kill zones spread across Ukraine's territory. It's become key to Ukraine building a sustainable technology advantage that it can use to attrit Russia's assaulting forces to such a level that the war becomes unsustainable for Russia to continue. The ministry mentions the $880 million figure we shared earlier, and it reveals that the drone line isn't an initiative that Ukraine is managing on its own. Support has been provided by the Netherlands to scale up the drone line project, the ministry says, with the funding provided being used to enable the mass procurement of FPV drones that now litter the kill zones that stretch beyond the combat lines. Plus, Ukraine has been spending big on bomber unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, which may include the long and mid-range strike drones that it's been using to wreck Russia's rear. Plus, the drone line project has seen Ukraine invest more heavily in ISR, or intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, which likely amounts to far more drone eyes in the skies that are beaming real-time footage of what they see to Ukraine's Delta system, which allows Ukraine to coordinate its drone strikes and other assaults. The drone line project demonstrates Ukraine's transition from fragmented use of drones to a systemic approach in which drones become a full-fledged element of defense tactics, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense says. But much more than that, it signifies that Ukraine's cooperation with other nations, particularly its European partners, is leading to the creation of a military power that is far beyond anything Putin expected. Far from being a country that was supposed to roll over, Ukraine is a country that has caused over 90,000 more casualties for Russia during just 3 months in winter. Around 30,000 of those casualties can be traced back to the drone line. Detect and destroy using airborne drones has become the new Ukrainian defense doctrine. The drone line is at the heart of everything, and it's a huge reason why Ukraine is suffering far fewer casualties than Russia in the war so far. Just imagine that you are a Russian soldier for a moment. You know that even earlier in the war, Ukraine's drones always presented problems. They destroyed Russian armor and conducted strikes against troop gatherings. But back then, there were gaps to exploit. Ukraine's drone defenses were fractured. So as long as your commanders found the right routes, which was never a guarantee, you might actually make it to Ukraine's fortifications so you could launch an attack. Now, just making it to the defenses is a lot harder. To get where you need to go, you have to traverse miles of terrain that you know is constantly being monitored by drones that are coordinating with every component of Ukraine's military. For all you know, a reconnaissance drone flying far overhead may already have eyes on you. Every step that you take is being transmitted to Ukraine's Delta system, and before you know it, FPV drones have descended on you. You're dead before you even make it a mile through the drone line. And it's not like things are going to get much better for those who go deeper. They have to deal with more drones and perhaps even Ukrainian search and destroy units that are leaning on the data being transmitted by the drone line to hunt them down. Now, we told you earlier in the video that one of Ukraine's goals with the drone line is to build a systematic advantage over Russia based on the technology that Ukraine employs. We're going to dive deeper into that very soon, but before we do, you are watching The Military Show, so if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time to hit the button. Returning to the expansion, Euromaidan Press reports that Ukraine's Ministry of Defense now sees the expansion of the drone line as a key condition for stopping Russia's ground offensives in their tracks. The new Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has even put a number on this halting of Russia's assaults. He says that Ukraine needs to get to the point where it's eliminating more than 200 Russian soldiers for every square kilometer that Russia gains. According to Fedorov, this is the level of losses at which further advance becomes impossible. We'll be looking at whether that really is the case toward the end of the video. But to achieve numbers like these, Ukraine needs to turn its already impressive drone line into an overwhelming behemoth that is capable of destroying Russians at a rate that is even more impressive than the 156 soldiers per square kilometer that it's managing along with Ukraine's other defenses in places like the Donetsk Oblast. That means more drones, more operators, and even greater collaboration that builds on the foundations created during the first year of the initiative. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense says that all of this is coming. On February 28, the ministry announced that it was seeking further backing from the Netherlands to help it expand the drone line initiative. The meeting has already taken place between Fedorov and the Dutch Defense Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Dylan Jezielgos-Zagarius. That meeting resulted in both describing the drone line as one of the most effective initiatives that Ukraine has in terms of strengthening the country's military. Fedorov added that he wants Ukraine's partners to support other drone projects that feed into the drone line initiative, such as an ongoing project to ensure that all of Ukraine's brigades have a baseline capacity when it comes to using UAVs. So that's a hint at the upcoming direction that the drone line is going to take. Ukraine has the drones, and it has over 1,000 crews capable of operating those drones. But if the drone line is to expand to the point where it can be spread across the entire 700-mile-plus front line, then every single Ukrainian brigade needs the capabilities that those 1,000 crews deliver. In other words, more crews, more training, and more Russian deaths caused by brigades that may have had limited use of drones being upskilled, so they're ready to make the drone line even stronger. Fedorov believes that this deeper integration of the drone line initiative into Ukraine's armed forces is the game changer that will allow Ukraine to hit the defense minister's ambitious targets for eliminating Russia's soldiers. In Fedorov's ideal world, Ukraine will find a way to inflict at least 50,000 casualties on Russia every single month. If that happens, Russia's assaults will stall out. Hitting this target would mean that Russia loses 600,000 soldiers per year. In 2026, Russia aims to recruit 409,000 soldiers. So you're already seeing where the shortfall would come into play if everything goes according to Fedorov's plan. If Russia is recruiting fewer soldiers than it's losing, Ukraine starts to see light at the end of the war tunnel. Russian offensives weaken as it can't bring reserves in to make up for its catastrophic losses, and Putin might end up becoming so desperate that he's forced to mobilize, which Russia's leader knows would be so deeply unpopular that it could tank the already diminishing support that his supposed special military operation has inside Russia. This is all part of Ukraine's long-term war goals. And, as what appears to be even deeper cooperation with the Netherlands on the horizon seems to suggest, it also means that Putin's attempt to manipulate Ukraine's European partners into withdrawing their support has failed. Stick with us as we'll be getting to those manipulations and their failure in a few moments. Before that, let's take a closer look at Fedorov's plan. On February 24th, the Kyiv Independent reported on this plan, which has been designed to ensure that Ukraine stays 10 steps ahead of Russia. A large part of the plan focuses on securing Ukraine's skies as best as possible. Fedorov wants to achieve a missile and drone interception rate of at least 95%, which will require cooperation from Western partners, along with the creation of more interceptor drones to tackle Russia's Shahid-type long-range drones. Perhaps the drone line will be expanded to help fund the creation of these interceptors, providing another way for Ukraine's program to feed into its long-term war goals. Ukraine's second goal is to make Russia bleed for every scrap of territory that it occupies, which we've already covered. 200 deaths for every square kilometer is a lofty target, but it's one that is possible if Ukraine can expand the drone line. However, perhaps the most important of Fedorov's goals is the third that he has presented, which is to destroy the Russian economy to the point where Putin is no longer able to fund his invasion. Fedorov mentions Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, oil, and the Shadow Fleet as key parts of this third goal, which doesn't seem to directly correlate to the drone line. However, Ukraine's drones are sapping Russia's finances in other ways. Every contract soldier that Putin sends into Ukraine costs Russia an enormous amount of money. Russia is essentially bribing the poor and otherwise disadvantaged to fight by promising vast sums of cash that they've never seen before. Take the one-time bonuses that Russia is paying out for its contract soldiers as an example. In a January 6th report, Kyiv Post revealed that Russia was paying out an estimated $21.5 million in signing bonuses every single day back in May 2025. Russia signed up 422,000 soldiers in 2025. If we divide that by 12 months, you get an average of about 35,160. That's not too far away from the 30,000 soldiers that the drone line is costing Russia during the winter alone, and it's likely far lower than the total number of soldiers that the drone line has eliminated since it was formed in March 2025. There's some even more interesting maths. May is a 31-day month. If Russia was shelling out $21.5 million per day in signing bonuses in May, that amounts to over $666 million spent on bonuses alone in a single month. And this is before we even consider the salaries offered to contract soldiers, or the cost to Russia to train and equip these soldiers. It's here where we see the drone line's impact on Russia's finances come into play. Around 30,000 Russian soldiers eliminated during the winter by the drone line alone amounts to close to a month of soldiers destroyed. That's well over $600 million down the drain, and Ukraine is expanding the drone line so that it can repeat and grow this feat over and over. It's probably not too much of a stretch to assume that Ukraine's $880 million investment into the drone line has already repaid itself, and then some, since March 2025 in soldier deaths alone. A lot more is going to be coming with the expansion of the line. Let's return to the point about Putin's attempts to manipulate Europe that we mentioned earlier. On January 15th, the Moscow Times shared comments that Putin made in which the Russian leader suggested that he was ready to restore relations with the European countries that have been supporting Ukraine. Russia was and remains committed to precisely these approaches and is ready to restore the level of relations we require. Our relations have deep historical roots, full of examples of mutually beneficial partnership and mutually enriching cultural cooperation, Putin said. This was a carrot on the end of a stick. It was also a sign of Putin's desperation. Russia's leader is trying to convince Ukraine's partners that abandoning Ukraine and allowing Russia to have its wicked way with the country is in the best interests of all involved. Apart from Ukraine, of course. It's attempted manipulation at its most base, and the very fact that the drone line exists at all showcases how badly this manipulation is failing. While Putin dangles the carrot, the Netherlands is not only contributing to the drone line but is actively working alongside Ukraine to expand it. In other words, Putin's manipulation attempts are only leading to yet more examples of cooperation between Ukraine and its partners. We're seeing this practically across the board. In 2025, Europe essentially replaced the US as Ukraine's main donor, Chatham House reports. That meant a 67% increase in military aid during the year. The European Union has also approved a €90 billion or $104 billion loan to Ukraine that has been designed specifically to prop up Ukraine's struggling economy so that it can continue its fight against Russia. The UK has also pledged more support for Ukraine in 2026, as have many other countries. So it's clear that whatever carrot Putin thought he could dangle is nowhere near tasty enough to convince Ukraine's partners to withdraw their support. If anything, that support is only growing stronger, and programs like the drone line prove it. Right now, the Netherlands is Ukraine's main partner on the project. It's not outside the realm of possibility that other partners will come on board to provide more funding, which will only help Ukraine to scale its Russia-destroying drone line even faster. And those partners have a secondary motive beyond helping Ukraine. The better and more effective that Ukraine's drones and the tactics that influence their usage become, the more that the rest of Europe can learn about how to adapt their own military doctrines to account for precisely the kind of war that Russia wages. Ukraine is even expanding the scope of its cooperation with partners outside of Europe and North America. On March 4th, the Odessa Journal revealed that Ukraine is going to be working alongside the United Arab Emirates and Qatar to help them counter Iranian Shahid drones that have been causing problems for those nations ever since the US launched its campaign against Iran. Putin might want to see that sort of cooperation. It only means that Ukraine is building bonds with yet more countries, this time in the Middle East region, where Putin is trying to cling to influence. More relationships could lead to further support for Ukraine, which again means possible expansion of the drone line and other programs. And that only means more deaths across the entire front line. With that, we return to Fedorov's claim that Ukraine eliminating 200 Russian soldiers for every square kilometer occupied would put an end to Russia's advance. Is that true? It seems very likely, as Ukraine already seems to be at the point where it's destroying more soldiers than Russia is able to recruit. That's according to Western officials reported on by The Telegraph, who claim that Putin's forces have been suffering around 40,000 casualties per month since November, at a time when Russia is recruiting 35,000 soldiers per month to sustain the invasion. One of those officials, Al Carnes, who is the UK's Armed Forces Minister, says that Russia's attempts to recruit more are also becoming more and more difficult. The reason, Carnes claims, is that people are realizing that it's a one-way ticket when they sign up for Putin's war. The drone line is one of the reasons why. As Ukraine's drones deal out more death than they have ever done before, the average Russian, who will likely have seen many of their friends and family members take one-way trips to Ukraine, is taking notice. The tens of thousands of dollars that the Kremlin is offering to each recruit are tempting, but it doesn't mean all that much when Ukraine's drones are snatching lives away at an incredible rate. It's only going to get worse for Russia from here on out. The drone line is getting bigger, and there's nothing that Putin can do about it. Another way to put all of this is that Ukraine has been turning the hunting of Russia's soldiers using drones into a 24/7 McDonald's-like operation. In fact, that's precisely how we put it when we covered Ukraine's Lazar group, which has been a massive influence on the drone line program. If you want to find out more about that group and what it's done since the beginning of the war, check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show. to see more about Ukraine's latest tactics and innovations, and thank you as always for watching.